I want to thank Amanda for inviting me here. Nice to be in front of a live crowd instead of on this side of the screen in Zoom, which I've been doing since April of 2020 because of the pandemic. Can you hear me okay back there?
Fine.
Good, good. My name is Evan Weiner. I've been doing this type of thing since 1971. I was 15 years old. I was at Spring Valley High School in Rockland County, New York. And I was in 11th grade, and I had a teacher by the name of Joe Dionisio, who I still keep in touch with 50 years later. He now lives in Arkansas. He still doesn't know my name. Student, student, student. You got a good voice. How would you like to be on radio? In the worst way I want to be on radio. And I was. We had a show called Tiger Talk, which was about Spring Valley High School. And it was a terrible show, but it opened the doors for me, and I met a guy by the name of Peter Brooks who worked with me. Also, Joe was instrumental in getting me to work for the Nyack Journal News and the Bergen Record over in Hackensack, which used to be a paper that made a lot of money because of all those shopping centers in Paramus. So by 1978, I was on WNEW radio. Remember WNEW radio? William B. Williams. My favorite guy there was Julius LaRosa, who was a sweetheart, absolute sweetheart. He was a disc jockey. I got to know him a little bit. And before he passed away, he moved to Palm Springs. And he was there with Jerry Vale, and he was part of a very prestigious group called the Romeos. Do you know what the Romeos are? Retired old men eating out. He, Jerry Vale, my friend Shelley Saltman, and others. So I've been around. I've done radio, I've done TV, newspapers, magazines, websites, and all that other stuff. And I'm talking about journalism. And let me just say this. Journalism is in the eye of the beholder. In other words, what somebody says is right, and you think it's wrong, but they think it's right, so it's okay because they think it's right. And you may think somebody is wrong, and that's okay too, to you to think that it's wrong. But journalism in the United States, there's no law in the United States that says journalism has to be truthful. Canada has some law that requires some aspects of journalism to be truthful. England does as well. But in the United States, there was a court case in 2003 involving a woman in a television station in Tampa, Florida, where the judge ruled, and he was correct. There is nothing that says journalism has to be truthful. If it was there, it would have been in the Bill of Rights or the Constitution. What we got in the Constitution is freedom of the press, which means pretty much you can say what you want. Journalism 101. That's me in Baltimore. The year is 2002. And I was doing a lot of op-ed writing for New York Newsday, the Baltimore Sun, the Orlando Sentinel, all members of the Chicago Tribune family, along with the Spanish paper in New York named Hoy. And I had a woman by the name of Betsy, who is my daughter's best friend, who was fluent in Spanish. And I would send her what I wrote in English, and she ended up translating it to Spanish. The nice part of this story was Betsy ended up becoming a professional translator, thanks to me. Anyway, the Baltimore Sun. This is 2002, August 2002, and I'm talking to a guy by the name of Richard Gross, who's the op-ed editorial editor of the Baltimore Sun. And I said, I want to do a piece. And he says, what do you want to do? I said, the Major League Baseball Players Association could go on strike against the Major League Baseball owners. Collective bargaining agreement was over. And fans think that they have no course of action to get back at the owners. But they do. And I listed all the owners and the businesses. At that point, the Detroit Tigers were owned by Tom Monahan, who owned Domino's Pizza. And I said, yeah, just don't go to Domino's Pizza, that's all. And I went place to place to place. But I left out one place. The Chicago Cubs, because the Chicago Cubs were owned by the Tribune Company, which owned the Baltimore Sun. And Richard was cool with that. He marks it all up, throws it in the newspaper. He goes on vacation. This thing is set to run on Sunday because Sunday is the main day for op-ed pieces whether it's the New York Times or the Baltimore Sun, and it doesn't appear. And I called down, I said, what happened to it? And Richard's on vacation. The guy says, well, it was killed at a higher level. It's a higher level. He says, yeah, somebody in Chicago. I'm saying, who could that be? Dennis Fitzsimons, CEO of the Tribune Company? Yeah, I think so. They had a problem with you suggesting boycotts. I said, and what was the problem? We're against suggesting boycotts. So I said, let me ask you a question. Sure. When South Africa was basically apartheid in South Africa, and there were a lot of people boycotting South Africa, did the Baltimore Sun say, we can't have an opinion about boycotting South Africa because of apartheid? With that, the guy slammed the phone down. I did a couple more pieces for them. Richard got fired. He ended up going somewhere else, and it was all my fault. And they've had my faults in a couple other places. But that, to me, is journalism 101. What you report doesn't necessarily get into the newspaper, on radio, and on TV, or even the internet. That's Johannes Gutenberg. And he's the father of the newspaper. Well, not really the newspaper, but the printing press. He invents the printing press. John Peter Zenga. John Peter Zenga, talking about the United States, even though it wasn't the United States back in 1730, whatever it was, when he printed something and somebody got upset about, and they had a trial, and that was freedom of the press. But the United States didn't exist at the time. It was the Southern colonies. Anyway, he's responsible for freedom of the press. That's Jack Kemp. I had a 30-year relationship with Jack Kemp. This is 1979, up in Spark Hill, New York. I'm 23 years old interviewing Jack Kemp. Now, today, this cannot happen because most radio stations don't have any news, but I have been on radio since I was 15 years old. And Jack Kemp, at this point, is beginning his presidential run for 1980, and I'm interviewing him up in Spark Hill, New York, about his intended platform for the 1980 run. And I was on with Sam Donaldson. Remember Sam Donaldson? Yeah. I was on ABC News Now, Politics Live, back in 2005, and that's Jeff Morrell, who left ABC. He ended up becoming a Pentagon spokesman. And Sam is still around, living in retirement, living the good life at his ranch in New Mexico. The printing press, Gutenberg. Because of this, you have newspapers. And newspapers were not set up to give you the news. Newspapers were set up to give you opinion. Gutenberg was the inventor of Europe's first printing press. It was a movable type press. He died penniless and blind in 1468, but he had a profound influence on the world because with the printing press, you could have that, a newspaper. He started an industry. 50 years after he invented the printing press, there were 500,000 books in circulation. There were about 1,000 presses in Europe, and it was freedom of information or ideas exchange. The first newspapers were in Germany, in Strasbourg and Wolfenbüttel. That was in 1609 when material was printed on a regular basis. The first newspaper in the colonies, before it became the United States, was the Boston Newsletter. And that started back in 1704, on April 24th. It was just a big, big half sheet, only 2 pages. And news was taken out of London newspapers, and there was some news from Boston. The paper would change its name several times. Margaret Draper, John Howe, who were Tories. They were Tories. They were loyalists. Had the paper first. The paper was discontinued when the British evacuated Boston in 1776. Another newspaper from that time is the New York Weekly Journal from 1734, and that's Zenga's newspaper. He was a German printer, and he was a journalist in New York City. See, he was frustrated too, see? And he was accused of libel by a guy by the name of William Cosby. Not Bill Cosby, William Cosby. And he was the royal governor of New York appointed by the king, but and he wrote some stuff and they thought it was slander and libel, and a jury said, no, 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 he could do whatever he wants, might be libelous, prove it. And that's where the United States tradition of freedom of the press started, actually as a British colony in 1734. And it took place over in Eastchester. This is a national landmark in Mount Vernon now, and they claim freedom of the press, but it didn't really happen there. But it's a building that might have hosted a newspaper back in the day at St. Peter's Church over in now Mount Vernon. It used to be Eastchester, and it was in Eastchester where Zenger wrote the newspaper. In 1733, he voiced opinions critical of the colonial governor William Cosby. November 17, 1934, on Cosby's orders, the sheriff arrested Zenger. Grand jury refused to indict him. The Attorney General, Richard Bradley, charged him with libel in August 1735, but his lawyers, Andrew Hamilton and William Smith Sr., successfully argued that truth is a defense against charges of libel. Washington was not thrilled with most of the press. Couldn't stand it, because they were always picking on him, he thought. Every president will say the same thing. They're always picking on me. You know, I'm always doing something wrong. Even General George Washington, President George Washington, he didn't like parts of the press. Oh, he liked the parts that said, George, you're great, but he didn't like the criticism. And, you know, Alexander Hamilton was his aide-de-camp, right? Alexander Hamilton was his aide-de-camp. George Washington picked him up during the Revolutionary War. He was born in Nevis, ended up in Bermuda, and somehow got to Washington during the Revolutionary War. And, you know, Hamilton, have you seen the play? If you've seen the play, you know, Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson hated one another, right? Just hated one another, and they're fighting over the Capitol, where the Capitol should be, and Jefferson says, hey, rather Hamilton says, hey, we'll keep the money here. We'll keep the money in New York. Take the Capitol. We want the money. And it's a song in there, Hamilton. So anyway, Hamilton's a New Yorker, through and through. This guy is a New Yorker, probably more so than I am. I mean, I was born in Manhattan. And so he decides he can't stand Thomas Jefferson. He really, really hates Thomas Jefferson. Why don't I start a newspaper, right? I'll start a newspaper and I'll just slam Jefferson by day. I don't know if any of you buy the New York Post, but the New York Post was started by Alexander Hamilton, and it was started as a broadsheet to tear apart Thomas Jefferson. The New York Evening Post was founded by Alexander Hamilton, broadsheet. His co-investors included New York members of the Federalist Party, such as Robert Troup and Oliver Wolcott. And they were really upset that Thomas Jefferson was elected president of the United States, and they were going to try to delegitimize him. And they were upset with the rise of the popularity of the Democratic Republican Party. They were out to delegitimize Thomas Jefferson and the Democrat Republican Party. Sound familiar? Has anything changed in 219 years? Anything changed in 219 years? Not really. Horace Greeley professionalized newspapers. Most newspapers were like Jefferson. I hate this, I hate that, I hate that. This guy is great. Sort of like when you watch cable TV news debates. We got to leave it at that. That's what the newspapers were like. And Horace Greeley actually professionalized newspapers when he founded the New York Tribune in 1841. But he was a Whig guy, the Whig Party. And his paper was to make sure that the Whigs' propaganda was sent out to people in New York. So he wanted to talk about reforms and economic progress in the 1840s, 1850s, and the elevation of the masses. But he actually set the highest standard in news. He professionalized it. The Whigs didn't particularly like the newspaper, even though they pushed the Whig Party. Greeley wanted to run for president eventually. and the Whigs never looked at him as a legitimate candidate. He had some interesting writers, including Karl Marx and Marxism. Newspapers, and you see this today with cable TV, newspapers had strong party affiliations. They were funded by the parties. If an editor's party won an election, he or she might end up with a patronage job in the next administration. By the 1890s, sensationalism became the key word. Pulitzer Prize now. It's about the highest thing that you can win in journalism, highest award you can win in journalism. Usually it goes to somebody from the New York Times or the Washington Post, usually. Joseph Pulitzer, though, didn't exactly have the highest standards of newspapers back here in New York. And there's William Randolph Hearst. William Randolph Hearst. Hearst and Pulitzer got into a circulation war in the 1890s. American journalism was changing in the urban areas, like New York. Some journals were saying that they were independent, taking strong issues on, or strong stances on issues, and they were above the fray. They're not going to get involved with party politics. But others built enormous circulation, like William Randolph Hearst did in New York, in the big cities with celebrity columnists, gossip columnists, aggressive sports coverage, which made baseball in the 1890s. Baseball was a popular sport, but it became bigger because of newspapers and sensationalist news. Does that sound familiar? Because if you watch channel 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, it's all sensational news. Local news is built on this formula: murder, mayhem, weather, sports, and entertainment. If you watch local news, you probably, to start, get about 5 or 6 crime stories. Crime stories, that's what you start with. So it's lasts to this day. William Randolph Hearst was rich. He was rich, and he wasn't afraid to go to war with Joseph Pulitzer in New York for circulation. He said, the New York Journal, 2 cents, I'm going to knock it down to 1 cent. Pulitzer kept the New York World at 2 cents. And this is the newspaper wars of the 1890s. Did you ever hear yellow journalism?
Yes.
Yellow journalism, right? Like, yellow journalism started because this cartoon character was drawn in yellow. Richard Outcault's Yellow Kid was an early comic. It appeared in the New York Journal's Colored Sunday section, wildly popular here in New York. During the 1896 campaign, Pulitzer hires him away from Hearst, and the Yellow Kid appeared in the wall. Now, the Yellow Kid turns out to be something else. The Yellow Kid, well, William Randolph Hearst liked him because in the San Francisco Chronicle, he used the Yellow Kid to warn about the yellow peril of Asian immigration. Have you heard anything in the last few years about anti-Asian type sentiment? Nothing is new. Nothing is new. Yellow journalism was born. They built enormous circulations for the newspaper in the big cities, and they did a good job, really good job.
Yeah. I'm so sorry, I have a question. So yellow journalism refers to covering stories about the Asian immigration?
Initially.
Okay.
Initially. And, all comes out of that cartoon character.
Okay.
And then the Spanish-American War. Should there have been a Spanish-American War? Well, Hearst once allegedly said, you provide the war, we'll provide the pictures.
Ugh.
And remember the Maine. Nobody talks about that anymore, the old, remember the Maine. Destruction of Warship Maine was the work of the enemy. They're going to give a $50,000 reward for the detection of the perpetrator of the Maine outrage. And this newspaper was to get you mad at the Spanish. Really get you mad at the Spanish. Assistant Secretary Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident. The journal offers $50,000 reward for the conviction of the criminals who sent 258 American sailors to their deaths. Naval officers unanimous that the ship was destroyed on purpose. Was it destroyed on purpose? We don't know after all these years. But that was what was going on. The New York Journal, the New York World, hey, they went after crime. They went after scandal. They went after salacious detail, which is kind of like watching local news on 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11 in town. Facts that got in the way of a gripping story could be left out. Imagery, imaginary details could be added. Remember I said news doesn't have to be truthful? 1890s, it wasn't. Any excuse to include an image of a scantily clad woman was welcomed. The goal was to create a sensation that would prompt people to buy copies of the paper. The papers supported the revolutionaries in Cuba in 1898, fighting for independence from Spain. San Juan Hill, Theodore Roosevelt, the Rough Riders. The rebels were cast in the same mode as the patriots who fought for American independence. Spanish atrocities were played up. Rebel atrocities didn't happen. They were ignored. The editorial line was that America should help. Remember, the maid even got on a postage stamp. You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war. Probably an urban myth. In 1898, the U.S. battleship SS Maine blew up while off the coast of Havana. The cause was never discovered, but the yellow press jumped to the conclusion that the Spanish did it deliberately. Remember the Maine became the slogan of the yellow press and got Americans to say, to war, let's go to war. I do Groucho Marx and Duck Soup. To war, Fredonia's going to war. But that would die off. Pulitzer decided, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore. I want to go legit. And he does. Also, the New York Times goes legit at the time, but Hearst would continue. Now, the movie Citizen Kane. How many of you watched the movie Citizen Kane? You like it? Did you like the movie Citizen Kane? You could answer me. I'm not marking you. Did you like Citizen Kane? Yeah, okay. Well, Citizen Kane, Orson Welles. This movie is based on Randolph Hearst, and he knew it. And this was a problem. A major problem for Orson Welles, a major problem for Citizen Kane. Censorship. Censorship in news goes a long way. Hearst banned any advertising, reviewing, or mentioning of the movie Citizen Kane in his papers, and he had his journalist libel Welles come up with stories, and Welles was going to sue. Many movie theaters, including Radio City Music Hall, refused to show the movie. Why? They were worried about Randolph Hearst damaging Radio City Music Hall and other theaters. They thought that he would put out the word, don't go there anymore, whatever it was. So they didn't show the movie. The New York Times in 1896, Adolph Ox bought the New York Times, the Oaks family rather, and they decided they're going to create a newspaper that would provide people with important news about the economy, politics, and the world. No gossip, no comics. The Times still does not have any comic strips. It has a reduced sports section these days. It's Tom Jolly, who is the sports editor of the New York Times, famously says to anybody he meets, nobody buys the New York Times to read about sports. There are now some gossip elements in the New York Times. They do have some gossip elements. Franklin Roosevelt kind of changed the paradigm. Roosevelt didn't want to deal with newspapers per se. He's president of the United States. And there's a new thing called radio. Radio, frequencies owned by we the people, the spectrum. And all those frequencies between 550 and now 1720 on the AM dial and 88.7 to 107.9 on the FM dial. He's president of the United States. He's the first guy that says, I want regular radio time. And he does, fireside chats. Now, Warren Harding, who's the first president where radio was involved back in 1921 to 23, used to give speeches. Herbert Hoover was on radio as well during the Depression, basically to talk about government programs, about aid and unemployment relief. But Roosevelt took it to the next level, bypassing traditional media. Doesn't have to talk to the Washington media of that day. And he would, 8 days into his first term, go on radio with something called the fireside chats. And he was the first president to effectively use radio and effectively use media. Today it's Twitter, if you want to do so, or Facebook or social media. Edward R. Murrow joined CBS in the late 1930s. Here's a dirty little secret on radio. People still to this day get the local newspaper and rewrite stories that are in the newspaper. I did it in 1970. Well, I figure the statute of limitations are over. I did it in 1977, 78, 79, 80, and 81. And Morrow's brought into CBS for a number of reasons. One is he's going to London, and they want him in charge of the London bureau. And two, they needed different people to deliver news. By the way, always present cigarette in his hand, Edward Murrow, as a young guy. So in 1937, he goes off to head CBS's European division. It was supposed to be a business job, but he turned the job into a journalism job. And there is Murrow, again, the ever-present cigarette. Murrow's boys, nobody has come close to assembling the kind of news people he had. Should be correctly Murrow's boys and girl. Some of the people that he had: William Shire, Charles Collingwood, Bill Shale, Howard K. Smith. Also a guy by the name of Joe Washburn, who was his producer. And his wife Shirley worked for CBS. The problem with Shirley is that there was, CBS said nobody could date, can't fraternize. And Joe and Shirley married. And to keep Bill Paley, who ran CBS, from knowing that Joe and Shirley were married, Shirley got her checks. Murrow knew, and he didn't want to get rid of Shirley. Shirley was one of the best in the business. But what he decided was, Murrow comes up with this idea. So Shirley can continue working, we'll pay her in her maiden name. I knew both Joe and Shirley. They were very, very nice people from Long Island. Television gets involved in news with the Dumont TV network in 1946. Before CBS, before NBC, before ABC, Dumont had a national newscast out of Washington, D.C. In 1948, Douglas Edwards comes on with news on TV. In 1949, NBC with John Cameron Swayze. But, you know, one thing that I find truly amazing from those days, the 30s and 40s, was just how important women were in journalism. Now, for instance, do you know that there was a woman who told the world that the Germans entered Poland to start World War II? Yeah, Claire Hollingsworth, who recently passed away at the age of 107, told the world that Germany invaded Poland. There was, in the Pacific Theater, there was Pauline Frederick, who went out there. There was Ruthie Gruber, who passed away a couple of years ago. She was about 102 years old. She lived in Riverdale, and she was a photojournalist, and she was one of the first people to enter Germany to see the concentration camp, the remains concentration camp. And then there's this woman, Martha Roundtree. Anybody sit here and watch Meet the Press on Sunday mornings? You watch Meet the Press? Chuck Todd? She invented Meet the Press. She did it in 1943, Mutual Radio. I'm an alum of Mutual Radio. In the 40s, women had some clout in the media, and she invented Meet the Press. It's the longest running show on TV. It started on November 6, 1947, with a woman who created it and a woman who hosted it. Eventually, she would be joined by Lawrence Spivak, who would buy out her share of the show. The Meet the Press has never had a woman host, or it's had one woman host, I should say. And when she left, she was never replaced. She was replaced by men. Yes?
Right. What? So how was she able to do that as a woman at that time, and yet no one has had a woman? And yet, do you know what I mean? Like, how is it?
She bought the time. She had people. She was able to buy the time. Remember, TV had 40,000 TV sets in 1947. So TV, they did anything. They experimented with everything and anything. She left the show. She went over to Dumont and did a new show on Dumont. She ended up working for the Washington Post in the 1960s.
I'm so sorry. Have they tried to get a female host for Meet the Press?
No.
In your
No,
journalism?
no, but CBS has gotten for, was there Face the Nation, and ABC sometimes has had a woman, and I can't think of her name right now. There was a woman on CNN who hosted the show, which now, who's hosting it? Jake Tapper is hosting the show. Crowley, Catherine Crowley hosted the CNN show.
Yeah.
So, I mean, women are still underrepresented, basically, but women had clout. By the way, the first journalist who was ever killed in Vietnam was a woman.
Oh, really?
Dickie Chappelle. Oh, wow. She was killed in 1965. She was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full honors. The show created by Martha Roundtree, Lawrence Spivak joined later. But the modern news that you see, whether it's CBS, NBC, or ABC, the half-hour shows, was invented by Camel. And it was this guy, John Cameron Swayze. I knew his son, Cameron Swayze. And he was, if you look at him, the perfect anchorman. Look at him. He's got the flower, the lapel, the tie, the nice suit. He looks nice. He's got the world behind him. But let's take a look at this show a little bit closely. Remember I talked about censorship? The makers of Camel cigarettes bring you the world's latest news events right into your own living room. Sit back, light up a Camel, and be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours. R.J. Reynolds was the parent company of Camel. And they said to NBC, you do the news. We'll sponsor it, but you know what? We got some rights here. The news was on for 15 minutes. Started February 16th, 1949 at 7:45 in the evening, and the news format is still used. But there was some censorship. NBC News reports were not allowed to show no smoking signs. The only person allowed to smoke a cigar while on the NBC News telecast was Winston Churchill. And for some reason in 1950, when the Korean War started, by the way, that war is still going on, it's 71 years old. When the war started, R.J. Reynolds said to NBC, can't cover it. Can't cover it. Why? They said no. There's Bill Paley at CBS. William Paley, who ran CBS, started in 1927, WCAU in Philadelphia. Bill Paley, Don Hewitt, was the guy who created 60 Minutes. I knew Don Hewitt, and Don Hewitt said 60 Minutes, because Don worked with Morrow, was a combination of highbrow Morrow, when he was at his best with McCarthy, and lowbrow Morrow when he's asking Jane Mansfield what's in her closet. So Bill Paley erected two powers of power, one for entertainment, one for news, according to Hewitt. Said in his autobiography, Tell Me a Story, and he decreed there be no bridge between them. However, it was Paley who would put Frank Sinatra and Edward R. Morrow on the radio and 60 Minutes on TV, who sometimes built a bridge between the two towers. There is Morrow. Morrow was approached to host a weekly show. his associate, Fred Friendly. And Ruth Friendly is part of the group, his widow, up in Riverdale that I talked to. And she and I hit it off really well because we spoke the same language. Morrow had been doing a radio show called Hear It Now, and well, why don't we do a show called See It Now on TV? Morrow had no idea how to film a show. He and Fred Friendly had to figure out what to do on the go. See It Now was the show that basically brought down Joe McCarthy. See It Now, March 9th, 1954. Morrow does the report on Joe McCarthy, on the blacklisting and looking for communists under every bed. And he uses McCarthy's words against him. Now remember one thing about McCarthy. He was built up by the news media. He always talked to them. So he always had publicity. Good or bad, he was always out there. McCarthy makes a fatal mistake. I'm going to challenge what Morrow says. And he does in 1954, and basically Morrow brings him down. It's April 6, 1954. McCarthy demands time, gets time, and basically Morrow destroys him, absolutely destroys him. His reporting didn't necessarily make William Paley all that happy. And by 1958, Paley had had enough of Edward R. Morrow, and he pulled one of his shows called See It Now. Morrow complained to Paley that he could not continue doing the show if the network repeatedly provided equal time to subjects felt wrong by the program. By 1960, Morrow was gone. His last show, Harvest of Shame. Go up on YouTube, watch the show from 1960. Only the names have changed. Only the names have changed, and it's in black and white. The plight of the American migrant agricultural workers. This changed presidential races. It's the first debate between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon in Chicago in September 1960 at the studios of WBBM in Chicago. How many of you watched this? Probably did. How many of you voted, if you were around those days, for Kennedy because of his appearance?
Not for that reason.
There were people who have told me that he was so handsome they had to vote for him.
Really?
Over the years, I've had people, but take a look at the visual here. It's black and white. Kennedy, the suit blends in. Look at Richard Nixon. Look at him. Looks like he's out there on the daylight today. Stuck in the IRT, going up 6th Avenue. He's a sardine in a can without air conditioning, without ventilation. It's about 125 degrees. He's got a 5 o'clock shadow. His suit looks wrinkled. His knee is buckling because he injured his knee. The question was, who looks presidential? Who looks presidential?
Kennedy.
Kennedy. Nixon looks like a guy who's been on the subway holding onto the strap, just hoping to get out. And that's where the presidential, who looks presidential, does he look presidential? That's where it starts. Howard K. Smith. Howard K. Smith would get in trouble next year, 61. Congress decided to suspend the equal time provision in the Communications Act, making it possible for these 4 debates between Kennedy and Nixon without candidates from smaller parties. And that's WBBM in Chicago. I knew Nixon because I dealt with Nixon in 85, 86, 87. So, I didn't know. Call me Dick. But he learned from that. And in 1968, he would go on Rowan and Martin's Laughing, sock it to me, showing that he had a sense of humor, which he didn't have. But anyway, so Nixon changed his presidential politics with this debate and also going on Rowan and Martin's Laughing. Television makes the candidates, it's because of visuals. You look at the candidates visually. You don't listen to what they say. I always listen to debates on radio. I don't listen to them on TV because you have to concentrate on radio. After all, radio is the theater of the imagination. TV isn't. And people look, Al Gore was orange in 2000. That's what people talked about in that Bush-Gore debate. Howard K. Smith gets canned at CBS. Gets canned at CBS in 1961 because of the civil rights movement. He was a correspondent who was covering the riots, civil rights movement in Birmingham, Alabama in 1961. And he gave an account of blood flowing in the streets. And Smith ended this documentary that he was going to do with a quotation from Edwin Burke. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for the good of man to do nothing. That got Paley really, really mad. Smith comes to New York. He had been working with Morrow. And he's told by Paley, now think of all the opinion that you hear on TV today. He's told by Paley, you violated the standards of objectivity. I've heard all this junk before, Paley said. If that's what you believe, you better go somewhere else. With that, Smith is fired. He would end up on ABC, but Bill Paley didn't want to rock the boat during the civil rights movement.
So he was a racist.
Paley? I don't know if you could call him a racist, but he was. All right, let me. Do I have Lucy in here? Okay, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm jumping from journalism here, but it's not journalism. It's part of the whole media package, and I do a whole talk on this. I Love Lucy. CBS approached Lucille Ball about doing a weekly program on TV in 1950. She jumped at the chance, but her first requirement for any show was a big problem. She wanted Desi Arnaz to play her husband. Now, here's the problem. She's from Jamestown, New York. Desi's from Cuba. And at that point, in 1950, 17 states barred interracial marriage. It wouldn't be until 1967 when the Supreme Court said interracial marriage was legal. They were legally married. CBS didn't like the thought that Lucy and Desi were going to be married on TV. Now, Lucy wanted to save her marriage. That's why they wanted to work together. She also knew talent. CBS wanted her co-host on radio, the My Favorite Husband show, which would become I Love Lucy, Richard Denning, to continue as her co-host. They were married. Ball said you have to have both of us or none of us. They were an interracial or multi-ethnic couple. Now, let's go back to Rutherford B. Hayes in the presidency of 1877, and this will answer your question about William Paley. Hayes becomes president not because he's elected president, because the Democrats and the Republicans cut a deal. Oh yeah, they're married legally, but the American Civil Rights Movement stalled 1875, 1876. Desegregation in the South ended with the Hayes-Tilden presidential race in 1876. Hayes would become president after the Democrats cut a deal with the Republicans. Democrats wanted federal troops out of South Carolina and Louisiana, and they wanted states' rights, and if they got that, they'd give up the Oval Office, which they did, and Hayes becomes president. At that point, interracial marriage was illegal in more than a dozen states. Also, there was the Red Scare, put out by the Hollywood Reporter and Red Channels. In 1947, the Hollywood Reporter does an unsourced story about all these people who are communists. Billy Wilkerson, Hollywood Reporter, owner, editor, publisher, started to expose so-called communists working in Hollywood. On July 29th, he published something called Trade Views that included the names of Dalton Trumbo, Howard Koch, and 9 other Hollywood players he branded as communist sympathizers. Wilkinson would ruin lives without doing any research. Without Wilkinson, you might not have had Joe McCarthy. And McCarthy starts his McCarthyism in 1950, McCarthyism in blackballing. Lucille Ball is outed as a communist. And she gives testimony to the House on Un-American Activities saying, you know, it was my grandfather, Fred Hunt, he wanted us to. As I recall, we did something to please him. I didn't intend to vote that way. As I recall, I did it. She registered as a communist. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was a big fan of I Love Lucy. May have saved Lucy. She swore that she never voted communist. And she said she was a strong conservative with a Puritan streak. I'm the most conservative member of my family. It's for her grandfather, a progressive and free thinker, She registered as communist, and then she goes to the media and basically says, I'm not a communist, and Desi Arnaz says, the only red thing about Lucy is her hair, and even that's not legitimate. So, that was Lucy. In 2012, Billy Wilkerson apologized for his father ruining lives and starting blacklisting. In 1950, CBS and Paley, you had to take a loyalty oath. A loyalty oath. In 1951, CBS created a security office staffed by former FBI agents into the political leanings of their employees, including Edward R. Murrow. Cronkite did the last good thing on TV. Cronkite. There was an adversarial relationship between the media and the Pentagon. By 1968, February 68, 35% of Americans said Johnson was doing a good job in Vietnam. The war's played out every day on TV. Cronkite airs a report, February 27th, about Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson sees it and allegedly says, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost America. Smothers Brothers. It ends on April 9th, 1969. CBS boss William Paley cancels the show. 72 shows. Maybe you watched the Smothers Brothers back then. You watched it. Did you like it?
Oh, sort of.
Yeah. Bill Paley had the resident hippie and David Steinberg and all those others. There's Paley. The Comedy Hour was one of the few primetime shows featuring political commentary. It came after, that was the week that was, which was on NBC in 1964. Oh, 1968-69, CBS censors the show. They don't want Harry Belafonte singing Lord Don't Stop the Carnival against the backdrop of riots at the Democratic Convention in 1968. Remember Paley built these two towers, no bridge? It was a bridge. So they replaced Harry Belafonte's segment, Lord Don't Stop the Carnival, and play a 5-minute Richard Nixon ad. Nixon's the one. Nixon's the one. 5 minutes. The show finally dies on March 9th, 1969, because Joan Baez was talking about her husband, David Harris, who was entering jail after refusing military service. And then there was a Jackie Mason joke about children playing doctor they didn't like. And then there was David Steinberg, son of a Winnipeg rabbi, who did sermonettes. And he did one about Moses and the burning bush. Paley hated it and decided to cancel the show. Oh, it's a good thing they canceled the show. Nixon had allies in the media to get rid of the Smothers Brothers. The CBS programming chief was a Nixon ally, Robert Wolf, and TV Guide publisher, Walter Annenberg. They took hard stances against the Smothers Brothers and helped stomp them out. Television or radio as a news medium, and this is the reason, depends on government license. Richard Nixon threatened to pull licenses of television stations who were critical to him in 1969. Newspapers have no restriction. Spiro Agnew went on the attack in 1969. November 13th, Des Moines, Iowa, Vice President Spiro Agnew accuses network TV news departments of bias and distortion. Agnew, perhaps the place to start looking for a credibility gap is not in the offices of the government in Washington, but in the studios of the network in New York. That sent a chilling message to the networks. Lay off Nixon. By the way, it was Patrick Buchanan, who's there on Nixon's left, who wrote the anti-news speech in 1969. In 1970, it was William Safire, who ended up with the New York Times, who wrote the anti-news screed. Chilling impact, declare war on the American media. Safire wrote words for Agnew. Daniel Shore. I went to a talk over in New Jersey, and his cousin was at my talk, and she said he had sharp elbows, particularly around Passover. Watch out. Daniel Shore was on Nixon's enemy list, the CBS newsman, along with Paul Newman. The Nixon enemy list came out September 9th, 1971. Oh, 2008, Nixon Oval Office tapes. Nixon, the press is the enemy. Establishes the enemy. Professors are the enemy. Oh, how many of you like Merv Griffin on TV? Well, this begins the end of Merv Griffin on CBS. The censored shirt. That's Abby Hoffman. CBS was uncomfortable with some of the guests that Merv Griffin had. He was going up against Johnny Carson starting in the 1960s and 1970. The political activist Abby Hoffman came on and he was wearing that shirt, and CBS blurred out that shirt. The problem was, a couple of weeks earlier, Roy Rogers wore the same shirt, and they didn't blur it out. Griffin was censored by Paley. He went back to syndication in 1972 and then made all of his money on Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, and the Jeopardy theme song, the Think song, made him tons of money. Watergate. There I am at Watergate, 1982. In 1972, Paley ordered the shortening of the second installment of a two-part CBS News series on Watergate after Charles Colson, an aide to Nixon, called him. Paley ordered the banishment of instant analysis by his news people following a presidential address. Paley's reporters took umbrage, believed that they were being censored in their reporting on Watergate. And Paley said, no, you're not going to sway public opinion with your instant analysis. It is no longer the Tiffany Network. Was, no longer. Morrow and Cronkite, distant memories. Oh, this guy, Daniel Ellsberg, Pentagon Papers 50 years ago, gives it to the New York Times. By the way, Ellsberg just came up with something recently, and I'm putting together a talk on the calendar year 1958, and he had papers that said that the United States was ready to nuke China and was ready to accept nuclear weapons hitting the United States from their ally, the Soviet Union. Anyway, Ellsberg, a government consultant, gained access to classified documents, leaked them to the New York Times. The reports revealed many large-scale attacks on the U.S. in Vietnam that the U.S. public was not aware of. The general feeling was the U.S. government misled the public, withheld the truth. The Pentagon Papers came out. The Times was slapped with an injunction order, so Ellsberg gave it to 16 other newspapers. Have at it, boys. And they did. Eventually, the Supreme Court said, yeah, print it. It's okay. 6-3 decision. For leaking the papers, he was charged with theft, espionage, and violation of Espionage Act. Howard Hunt, one of Nixon's plumbers, told Nixon, let's neutralize Ellsberg and let's break into his psychiatrist's office, Dr. Fielding in Los Angeles. They do. And they were trying to discredit Ellsberg. That's the plumbers. Howard Hunt, G. Gordon Liddy, who hosted his TV and radio show, James McCourt, Chuck Colson, they break into the psychiatrist's office looking to discredit Ellsberg. During the trial, Ellsberg's lawyers find out all about that. The first time I found out about the break-in was when the government prosecutors revealed it to the judge. Told my lawyers Nixon wanted that information withheld, but he was warned this would make him criminally liable. This was the practice run for Watergate. Dr. Frank Stanton, CBS, threatened with jail, 1971. A report selling in the Pentagon about $30 million campaign by the Defense Department to improve its image. The House Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee demanded the material from the program to be cut. When he refused to comply, he was called before the committee and said, if newsmen are told their notes, films, and tapes will be subject to compulsory process so that the government can determine whether the news has been satisfactorily edited, the scope, nature, and vigor of their news reporting will inevitably be curtailed. Well, I don't have to tell you much about these guys, Woodward and Bernstein. June 19, 1972, the Washington Post, Bernstein and Woodward revealed that one of the Watergate burglars was James McCourt, a Republican security aide. Nixon, his war on the media. He had an enemies list. He tried to yank the license of the television station owned by the Washington Post because of Watergate and the Pentagon Papers. Today, it leads. Local TV, news is murder, mayhem, sports, entertainment, and weather. Perp walks, showing crimes being committed, sketches of criminals, major part of the local news. What's not a part of local news are stories that matter to the people, like I learned in 1978. Taxes, potholes, broken streetlights, why the snow isn't being shoveled, why your garbage isn't being picked up. Local TV will promote a show on network news as a story. This is CNN as we round out here. That's me in the middle, back in 1986. CNN, well, CNN won't be signing off until the world ends. We'll be on. We'll cover the end of the world live, according to Ted Turner. That will be our last event. We'll play Nearer My God to Thee before we sign off. There is a video of Ted Turner imitating Porky Pig, saying, that's all, folks. 1980, when Ted starts, they're losing $1 million a month. Why CNN ended up in Atlanta? New York Bank said no. It's not going to work. Chicago Bank said yeah. CNN, Turner says it's going to be based in Atlanta because those people in New York, they don't deserve us. No one thought it would work. It would be a money loser. But Ronald Reagan in 1984 signed the Cable TV Act. And that socialized cable TV. If you wanted basic expanded, you had to take all or you took nothing at all. And CNN, TBS, other Turner properties, along with ESPN, the Weather Channel, would all survive. The bundling concept saved headline news. Turner built his company because of that into CNN Headline News, CNN International, TNT, Cartoon Network, Turner Classic Movies, along with Castle Rock Entertainment, which did the Seinfeld show, Noon Line Cinema. He's gone by October of 1996. There's a merger with Time Warner, and Time Warner would merge with AOL, one of the greatest failures in American history. Then Time Warner would drop AOL from its name, and AT&T recently bought Time Warner. Ted and Gerald Levin. Levin changes CNN. Turner said that he predicted the demise of newspapers 30 years ago, called print journalism an obsolete way of distributing information. And today he says that it's too bad that only a few corporations own news networks. And that guy with the microphone, Jack Kelly, late Jack Kelly, and I'm at the end there, told me about how Ted Turner wanted to beat Rupert Murdoch up in a fight. Turner asked Jack if he could have a boxing match for charity with Rupert. He wanted to physically knock out Murdoch. Kelly said, he's 10 years older than you. Probably be unwise. Rupert Murdoch is the money behind Fox News Channel, starts in 1996. Murdoch and News Corp own hundreds of local, national, international publishing outfits, including the Sun and Times in the UK, the Daily Telegraph, Herald Sun, Australian. In Australia, Wall Street Journal, New York Post, HarperCollins, and they used to own Sky News in Europe. They don't anymore, and Sky News Australia and Fox News. There is nothing fair and balanced in the New York Post or Fox News. The outlets were designed to reach Republicans and conservatives. The paper and news channel, their slant promote Republican and conservative ideas. Murdoch is a throwback to Hearst. New York Post, great headline, headless body and topless bar. Murdoch came to New York in 1974. He bought the Star tabloid newspaper, then the New York Post. He becomes a U.S. citizen in 1985 to satisfy a legal requirement that U.S. citizens can own TV stations like Channel 5 in New York, which was WNYT-TV. Murdoch buys it, has to get rid of the New York Post under the old rules, sells it to Peter Calico. Mario Cuomo saved the New York Post in 1994 from going under. 1993, Murdoch wanted to reacquire the Post. Cuomo persuaded the FCC to give Murdoch a waiver from cross-ownership rules. He could own a TV and TV station and a newspaper in the same market. Fox News Channel, created by Murdoch, appealed to a conservative audience, hires Roger Ailes, 17 million subscribers in October 1996. They have about 80 million now. Fox has a really bad reputation among journalists. Their lawyers, every time they're sued, say in court, don't take us seriously, we're just infotainment. And there's me, I was on MSNBC, that's a number of years ago. MSNBC and its website were founded in 1986, a deal between General Electric's NBC and Microsoft. They are separate companies now. And MSNBC started in 2015, transitioning from left-leaning programming to hard news. They're back to left-leaning programming. And they started using NBC TV news on MSNBC. I'm going to leave you with Stephen Colbert, 2006, White House Correspondents' Dinner. The media has thin skin. Here's Colbert, who's hired by the media at the Correspondents' Dinner. Listen here, let's review the rules. Here's how it works. The presidents make the decision. He's the decider. The press secretary announces those decisions. And you people of the press type those decisions down. Make an announcement type. Just put them through spell check and go home. Get to know your family again. Make love to your wife. Write that novel you've been kicking around in your head. You know, the one about the intrepid Washington reporter with the courage to stand up to the administration. You know, fiction. Oh, he got scorned. New York Times didn't bother talking about him. Chicago Tribune, Lloyd Grove, the gossip columnist for the New York Times, said Colbert bombed badly. But it's still one of the most popular comedian takes on the Washington media ever. And just to make sure that that wouldn't happen again, Rich Little was brought in 2007. I'll leave you with Lewis Black and Chuck Todd, and we'll have to leave it here in 2014. Lewis Black, the comedian, asked, why don't you ask the tough questions of Chuck Todd? Chuck Todd said, well, we all sit there because we know the first time we bark is the last time we do the show. There's something where all of a sudden nobody will come on the show. My job was to do interviews with Tom Griffin, Orange and Rockland Utilities back then. Cable TV news now resembles talk radio. Fairness doctrine ended that in 1987. 1949, the FCC said that broadcast licenses are to cover controversial issues in a fair and balanced manner. It's called the Fairness Doctrine. They got rid of it in 1987, and that brought in people like Rush Limbaugh, be angry and vent. And that's what he did. Say what you want, there are no consequences. It applied to licensed TV stations and radio stations, never any restriction on TV. And now you got social media. And there are no easy answers as to how to regulate Twitter, Facebook, or other platforms, except to permanently ban people who spread misinformation. We have to leave it there, as they say. It's me in 1979, my Secret Service pass. Anyway, any questions or comments?
Too much to digest all at once.
It's my life. Did you get your answer about Paley?
Yeah, I mean, I have my own personal opinions based on several of his actions, but it is interesting with some of his behavior that they still have the Paley Center for Media.
Put up the money.
Yeah.
Money talks. There's the Annenberg Center too.
Yeah.
And Annenberg was as bad a guy as you could get in terms of truth.
Did people speak up to Paley a lot? Like, did the people that worked for him,
They tried.
Was there a lot of, like,
They
tension?
tried.
They tried, yeah.
They tried. They failed. They tried. They failed.
Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't know that about it.
So, well, thank you.
Thank you, yeah, thank you very much.
That was really interesting.
Still
Question
frustrated.
How we solve all these problems.
Well,
we
it's
have
so
with the
political.
press now.
I mean,
It's all political.
It's all, I mean, I knew it was political. I didn't know how political it was.
It's all political. It's all political. It's all about money. But it's always been that way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
how do
always
we
been-
solve what's going on now?
You know, I just wrote a 1958 talk over the weekend because I had nothing to do. And the problems in 1958, Middle East, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, problems in Latin America, Venezuela, Colombia, Cuba, problems with the Soviet Union, problems with China. Nothing's been settled. Nothing's been settled. It's the same old song, as they said. So
It's
anyway,
yeah,
I want to thank you, and maybe we'll do this again at some point. So hope you, I don't know if you can enjoy something like this, but enjoyment, I'm not sure. But anyway, that's my life.